You've like clued me up now.
Tell Jeremy to shut up.
Hey everyone, welcome to Fenders and Marketplace. Yeah, pretty cool. So, just a quick recap of who the Fenders organisers here tonight are, just in case you get lost or need a friend. We got DT down the front here, Anton up the back, Mandy, where's Mandy?
At the door.
Mandy's at the door. I'm here, and Fong is also a Fenders organizer, incognito here tonight. Just quickly, DT, the slides for that market for stuff.
Next one.
Alright, so just a quick reminder that DDD is coming up on the 13th of August. If you don't have a ticket, unlucky, I think it was about 5. And the Fenders Casual Catch-Up is coming up in August, which will be down at Besk.
14th.
It's on the 14th. Anton has scheduled it on the 14th of August. There we go. Cool. So, a couple of job opportunities going at the moment for some Fenders. Higher up, which is where Mandy and Jess, one of our other organisers, work. For a mid software engineer, senior software engineer, and senior product designer. So if you're interested in that, speak to Mandy. Human. Does anyone want to work with you, DT?
Look.
So some friends for DT at Human. They do some awesome website stuff. And Canva, you work with Fon. Is it on your team, Fon?
No, I don't work with this thing, but someone was passing it.
Cool. And also our Slack channel. So Slack is pretty fun for just having a chat around. There's lots of job postings, help channels for various bits and pieces, and some smack talk and opinion if you're into that. So just quick thanks to Marketforce, just there we are, for letting us use the room tonight. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things while we're here. So the male toilets are just here, and the female toilets are just around the corner. And if you wouldn't mind, just don't go past this hallway or past the ladies' toilets. You don't know what is lurking around in the building.
I'll send you a desk.
Yeah. If there is a fire, just go straight through the middle doors there and all the way down and then out the back and just keep running. Actually, probably don't hang out in the car park and we'll check that everyone's there first, and then I'll send DT back in to get anyone that's lagging behind. Cool. So tonight we've got two talks. We've got Luke, who's going to talk about Deno, a new way to do JavaScript stuff, and Sam, who will teach us to do functional programming in JavaScript. It's pretty fun, that. So Sam has drawn the short straw to go first.
Was there a straw drawing? I missed it.
It was either that or paper, scissors, right? Yeah, so I'll hand over to Sam and we'll kick off.
Oh, that's the wrong way around. There we go. Okay, thanks for having me here, everyone. My name's Sam. You might have maybe seen me around other events around. I've been floating around for a while. I'm a independent, self-employed software consultant. I describe myself. I mostly do native mobile apps and mobile backends. I do a little bit of JavaScript and front-end development, but not a whole heap. So feel free to heckle if I'm doing it wrong. And anyway, today I'm here to talk to you about functional programming in JavaScript. So one of the things that I've often been asked is, I do functional programming. I've been doing it for a few years. I'm one of the organisers of the Perth Functional Programmers Meetup group, And I've sort of been evangelising functional programming for a little while. I do think there's value in using more functional techniques in our code. And I have been asked this question multiple times, and not just by Amy, but I've never really had a good answer. And the functional programming community in general has sometimes had a bad reputation for responding to this sort of question with, you should learn Haskell. Because even though that's both true and unhelpful, it is a really good way to learn functional programming, but not an awful lot of people have the time or the inclination or the disk space required to learn Haskell. And I think one of the reasons why I've struggled with the question is you can sort of generalise it to how do I do programming, and there's no sort of single correct answer to that question. It's a it depends type of question. So instead of saying to you, do this and you'll be doing functional programming, I'm just going to explain what functional programming is and how to recognise it and why I think it's worthwhile, and I'll show you a couple of examples of functional techniques in JavaScript. I should mention I am saying JavaScript, but most of my code samples are in TypeScript. I'm hoping everyone's able to read TypeScript okay. It was just a little bit easier to talk about the types with the types in there. I will mention sort of JavaScript if there is a difference. All right, so what is functional programming? If you Google what is functional programming, you get a ream of different answers, most of which make no sense at all. They might talk about higher order functions or using a quote unquote functional language, or meaningless jargon like referential transparency. My definition of functional programming that I think is useful is writing as much of your code as possible using pure functions. So again, this is my personal opinion. I think that's what's the important part of functional programming. You might find people that disagree with that, but I think this is hopefully not too controversial. Obviously, that begs the question, what is a pure function? Pure funk. Yeah, I do have terrible visual puns here. So there are two main attributes that make a function a pure function. Does anyone want to have a stab at what they are? Yeah, Chris might know.
Function generates no side effects.
Excellent answer, Chris. You must be in the functional programs meetup group. A function is pure if it generates no side effects, and a side effect is some sort of observable change to the state of the world after the function's executed, if you know what I mean. So examples of side effects are things like making a network request, manipulating the DOM. Can everyone read that? This screen is quite small. Yep, okay. Writing to local storage is a side effect. Modifying global variables would be a side effect. And probably the most subtle one, if you change an object that you've been passed in as a parameter, if you mutate the object, that is a side effect as well. Okay, there's one more attribute that we want for pure functions. It starts with D. Does anyone know what it is? It's a bit more subtle. It is deterministic. So a pure function is deterministic, and what that means is every single time it gets called with the same parameters, it will return the same result. Okay, 1 + 1 is always 2. Not 1 + 1 = 2 unless window.use weird addition then return 3. So examples of what would make a function non-deterministic, and it's probably easier to go through some of the common ones. Accessing the current date and time. Okay, if you're doing something with current date and time, it's probably going to work differently each time you run the function. Generating a random number, and accessing a global variable, so changing your behaviour based on something that's in a global variable. So that was, I guess, a fair bit of a few rules there. So just to explain what's going on, we're going to play a little game called Pure versus Impure. So Impure is a sadly defunct German death metal band, apparently. Yeah, and they look 90s-ish. I don't know who they are. So I'll pop up some code which might not be that visible on the stream. Apologies for that. And we'll have a bit of a try and work out whether it's a pure function or not. So let's start with an easy one. Adding two numbers together. Do we think this is a pure function? Yes. Yes. So I sort of gave it away before, but yes. There's no side effects, and we're always returning the same result given the same parameters. Okay. What happens if we store the result in our local storage? Yeah, not a pure function. We are performing a side effect. if you do need to do some sort of a side effect, it's best to try and split that out from our logic, so we can keep our logic a pure function and then we do our side effect afterwards and store the result in local storage. What about this one, validating your user? Impure. So what we're doing here is we are mutating the user object that's been passed in as a parameter. Okay, what that means is any other code elsewhere in our application that has a reference to that user suddenly sees a change. Okay, so we've performed some sort of a side effect. So probably a better way to do this would be to return a Boolean value from this function. So we can do it if validate user blah blah blah, and then do whatever we need to do. So that's probably a better way. And a good red flag is if you've got something that doesn't return a value at all, it's probably performing a side effect. So that's a useful sort of indicator there. The other thing, because sometimes we do need to modify objects, the right way to do that from a functional perspective is to return a copy that's been modified. Okay, so I'm not sure if this is valid JavaScript code as well. This is TypeScript. And yep. So what we're doing here is returning a copy of the user just with the valid flag set to true or false. So any code that has a reference to our original user that we passed in will still see the original user, but because we've got a new user which has got the valid flag set, then we can perform whatever processing we need to do. I'll just, obviously, immutable data and functional programming do sort of go hand in hand. There's a few sort of helpers we can use within TypeScript. We've got the read-only wrapper that's available on our parameters, and also things like asconst and read-only properties. I'm not going to go into detail in immutable data, but just sort of flag it that if you're doing functional programming, you probably want as much of your objects to be as read-only as you possibly can get. JavaScript, I'm not sure what you can do. Object.freeze, I think, and there's some ESLint configs that can help you pick up object mutation. All right, so is this one a pure function? Do we think?
Depends on an external variable can change.
It does. So this looks like some sort of a global module variable. It's going to, if we run the same function again with the same user, it might change depending on that. So if you're in this situation, the way to transform this into a pure function that doesn't depend on a global is to pass it in as a parameter. So this is typically what we want to do if we're trying to make our code, pure functional code, is we pass our values in as a parameter. So this one is a nice easy one for you. Pure function? No. So we're making a network request here. Network requests are both side effects and they are also non-deterministic, especially things like a username availability. Every single time you run it, you might get a different value. So again, the way to solve that is we do our network request separately to our logic and then pass it in as a parameter. What about this one? Does anyone have a... No? So the problem with this one is getting the current date is going to return a different value every time you run it. Okay, so it's common to see this sort of code where someone will set it up and they might set up a unit test and they'll set it up with a user's date of birth, which was 17 years ago, and then next year the test suddenly starts failing and no one knows why. So we don't want to try and access the current date within, if we want it to be a pure function. Again, we need to pass that through as a parameter if we're trying to make sure that we're not doing any sort of non-deterministic code. So those were the easy ones. Here's a little bit of a harder one. Okay, who thinks this one is a pure function? Yes, no. So technically console.log is a side effect, but personally I'm a little bit pragmatic about that and I don't spend too many brain cycles worrying about it. In a browser application, users aren't going to see it and it's not going to affect the operation of the code, but it depends how hardcore you want to be, really. There are ways of doing logging in a pure functional manner, but they're all a pain. So I tend not to worry too much if you're doing a little bit of a console.log here and there. What about this one? This is a tricky one as well. yes, no. There's a few differing opinions on whether or not you should consider this a pure function.
I'd say no.
Yeah, a lot of people will say no. Personally, I think it is a pure function. It's deterministic. It will always return the same result for the same inputs, and it doesn't perform side effects unless you view an error as a side effect.
It's not true. No, it's not a pure function because if you throw an error, it's not returning anything.
Right, so what this is and this isn't really necessary for understanding functional programming, I just like talking about them. This is a special type of pure function called a partial function. And a partial function is a function for which there are some combinations of parameters that won't return a value. And won't return a value is a functional programming euphemism for throws a runtime error. The classic example of a partial function is integer division. So integer division has potential combinations of parameters anywhere where the divisor is 0, where it won't return a value, or the function's not defined. But you know, we would still consider integer division to be a pure function. You know, it's maths. You know, so yeah, my personal belief is it's pure. In practice, though, we don't really want it. We don't want partial functions in our code because they might throw errors, and so we want to get rid of them. Now, interestingly, in JavaScript, integer division is a total function. It's not a partial function. It's a total function because it returns a value. If divided by 0, it returns not a number. Okay, and that gives us a hint as how we can fix this one. All we need to do is return some sort of error value. In this case, I'm returning an invalid string. I don't know if people normally do that way in real-world TypeScript code, but you can fit it into whatever your error handling approach is within your application. And this is a very functional approach. It's making sure that we're always returning a value, and certainly within TypeScript, the compiler is going to help us and say, hey, you haven't handled this case where you've got an error potentially coming from this function call. All right, so that was impure. This, by the way, is the Brooklyn death metal band Impure. It is not the German death metal band Impure. You don't want to mix them up. It would be embarrassing. So I think understanding what pure functions are is 80% of functional programming, particularly in languages like JavaScript. So you're all functional programmers now. Congratulations. And just to recap. Apparently it's some sort of Greek phrase. I don't know. So pure functions can't make network requests, they can't change the DOM, they can't change local storage, they can't access or change global variables, can't mutate objects, can't create random numbers or access current date and time. So they sound pretty useless. And yes, it is, you can't write a useful program only using pure functions. At the end of the day, you do need some sort of side effect code to show user interfaces and to prompt for input and that type of thing. So why would you bother? Why, if you can't do pure functions everywhere, what's the benefit of having some of your code as pure functions and some not? Look, for me, the main benefits are pure functions are hopefully it's apparent that they're very easy to test. Okay, if you've got a pure function, you put in some inputs in a unit test and you check the output, and that's it. There's no complicated mocking or context setup or sort of trying to manipulate the current date that's reported by the test framework. You just put some parameters in, you check the output. If it's right, it's right. And the benefit of that is it's very repeatable. Okay, so if it works, if a pure function works in your unit test, it works everywhere. Okay, even if everywhere is an IE8 browser tab that's been open for 3 months and it's set to a Russian locale in +14 time zone during a daylight saving changeover, it doesn't matter. It's still going to work. Okay, and there's a lot of confidence that you get out of knowing that large sections of your code are always going to work the way that you're expecting them to work. And it's how you get a lot of, it's how you improve the reliability and reduce the bugs in your code. The other one, and this starts getting a bit more esoteric, the effects on the larger code base, is that it's more what we call composable. So some of you may have heard the term composition over inheritance, which was really popular in the object-oriented sort of software community a while ago. And essentially what that's trying to say is it's much better to build up complex logic out of small building blocks than it is to build some sort of huge chunk of logic on its own. And one of the reasons for that, not only is some sort of huge, massive 200-line method really hard to maintain and work out what it's doing, and you're mixing concerns, logic and UI and side effects and those sorts of things. It's also really difficult to modify. If you need it to do something slightly different, you don't have any good options. You can maybe pass in another parameter and do some if statements in there and make it even worse, or you can copy and paste that gigantic method somewhere else and modify bits of it and live with the fact that you've got duplicates, or embark on an arduous and doomed refactoring approach, which you don't know if it works because there's no tests. In contrast, if we're doing functional style code, we're probably building that up just out of little small building blocks that we understand exactly how they work, and we can build up a relatively complex set of logic out of some quite small components. And I'll show you some examples of that. But classic examples would be builder style APIs, those sorts of things where you build up more complex stuff out of simpler bits. And the other benefit, understand. This is Pete working from home here. Is it wrong to want one of those?
It was understandable that everyone wants one.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So you might have heard the phrase functional code's easier to reason about, and if you've heard any of Tony Morris's talks, sometimes he says that he's not smart enough to write JavaScript. And I sort of never really understood any of that until I had done some functional programming, and I sort of, it's something that it's easy to experience and it's hard to explain, but I'm going to give it a go. So when you're writing code, and you're in the zone and you're coding away, what's happening is you're loading into your short-term memory a whole, the coding context, the understanding of exactly what the program's doing. So you're thinking to yourself, when you're writing this piece of code, this might affect this bit over here and that bit over there and that bit there as well. Okay, and that's hard. It's really difficult to do, especially if you do have lots of code that that affects everything else. If you've got shared objects that you can change from anywhere. In contrast, if you're working with pure functions, you only really need to worry about the parameters and the output. It makes the task of coding a lot simpler. And again, it's very hard to explain, but it's sort of, once you've experienced it, it does, you do feel like, how was I able to do this before? So, I don't know if that helps at all, but that's sort of one of the benefits that I think we should be shooting for. Okay, assuming I've convinced you, how do we do it? So JavaScript community's got this reputation for solving any programming problem by installing a package. Okay, don't do that. There are functional programming libraries out there, but I don't think they give you an awful lot of value. One of the problems, FPTS I'm picking on here a little bit because it's one of the more popular ones these days. FPTS is designed for Haskell developers who are being forced to write TypeScript but don't really want to. And I think one of the problems is there are really good reasons why you're using JavaScript for your front-end code. It's something you're familiar with. There's plenty of sample code out there you can copy and paste off Stack Overflow. You can hire front-end developers and they'll be able to sit down and get up to speed relatively quickly. Most of that goes out the window if you've got something like FPTS because it doesn't look anything like regular TypeScript code. The other thing that I think those sorts of libraries suffer from is a bit of cargo cultism, in that they think the only way to do functional programming is to copy exactly what Haskell does, and I don't think that's true. So that's I think there's ways of coding more functionally without necessarily just sort of aping whatever Haskell's decided to do. So that's why I'm saying don't do that. So what do you do? Well, the spoiler is you're already writing functional code. Functional concepts have been migrating into mainstream programming languages for decades. So there are a lot of things that you're doing day to day that are sort of inherently functional. They've been adapted from the way that it's been done in functional languages over the years. So one of my favourite examples, and one of the earliest examples, is collection pipelines. What Martin Fowler calls collection pipelines. So this is how we might have done some sort of array processing in the past. I don't know if anybody still does array processing like that. Hopefully not, but if you are, I'm going to change your life today. That's good. So I've got an array of orders. I want to get an array of order IDs from those orders. So what I would do would be create some sort of a temporary array. I'd loop through the orders. I'd add the order ID to that temporary array, and then I'd return it. And bingo, I've got an array of order IDs. Of course, today we can use map. Okay, does everyone know how map works? Yes, no? If anyone doesn't know, please, by all means, stick your hand up, because I'm happy to explain it.
Explain how map works.
Thank you, man.
Isn't it a mask over a for loop?
What's that?
Isn't it just a mask over a for loop?
Just a mask over a for loop. That's an interesting take. So, no, look, what map does here is we're taking a function here as a parameter. It is a pure function. You will notice it only operates on its input and returns an output. And this is a transform function which is being applied to each element in the array. Okay, and it applies this same function to each element in the array to create a new array of the transformed results, and then returns you that. So this is obviously transforming an array of orders and returning an array of order IDs. I think there's obviously, in a simple example like this, maybe there's not as big a benefit. I think there are opportunities to stuff this up still, so I'd prefer doing it this way anyway. But when we do more complex code, that's when this sort of approach really does start helping a lot. So just briefly, what I'm trying to do here is pull out all of the orders that are due now, map it just into a flat array of order lines, filter out anything that's not yet ready for dispatch, group it by product ID, pull out all of the product IDs where the total sum of those products that we need to dispatch is more than 10, and then just give me a list of those product IDs. So these are all pure functions. I'm building up very, very complex logic out of small building blocks, and at the end of the day, this is very functional code, so it's easy to test. We can understand what it's doing. We're confident that it's always going to do what we wanted it to do. So I do think using these collection pipeline type methods are a core competency of modern developers. Hopefully they're teaching it at university these days. I don't know, it's been a long time, but I do think it's hopefully no one's. You can sort of imagine what that would look like if you were doing nested for loops there. Now I have taken a bit of poetic license here because there's no group by and no sum by available on the array prototype out of the box. Let's have a look at what that might look like. So I've got an example of how we might implement sum by here. And this is using reduce, and reduce is the all-powerful array function. We can use reduce to redefine any of the other operators that we want to perform on our arrays. It is the most complicated one to understand, I guess, the hardest one to really to grok, as it were. But it is worthwhile because it's very, very powerful. So what we're doing here, we're taking an array of items and some function which extracts a number from the array, the value that we're going to sum. In this example here, it'll be pulling the quantity out of the order line. Then we're calling reduce. And reduce, I'm going to start at this side. We've got 0, which is our initial value. Okay, and we've got a function here which takes 2 parameters. The first one I've called total. Sometimes this is called an accumulator, but we can think of it as a running total in this case. And then the item that we're iterating through. So reduce is going to go through each of the elements in the array. The first one, it's going to plug 0 in as the total, which is our initial value. Current item, it'll get the value out of the current item. Let's say it's 5. Okay, it'll return 0 plus 5. And then next item, it'll plug 5 in as the total. Okay, and it'll continue doing that until it reaches the end, and it'll give us the sum of all of the values. So that's how reduce works. Don't worry too much about it. If it's worth studying if you have a chance and trying to understand how it works, because often you want to make your own pipeline modifiers, and reduce is usually what you would need to use to do that. Now, who's seen reduce functions elsewhere in JavaScript code? Does anyone use Redux? Okay, Redux has got this concept of an app reducer. There's a variety of reducers. And you can see what we've got here is we've got an initial state, and then we've got a function which takes our state and our action. And it applies the action to the state to return a new state, which then gets plugged in next time we have an action. So this is basically the same thing. Okay, it's a functional concept. It's applied, and by the way, it only works because our reducer function is a pure function. You'll notice if you do have a look at the Redux docs, it'll say to you things like, don't use date, don't generate random numbers, don't look at global variables, don't perform side effects within the reducer, that type of thing. So it is a pure function, and the reason why it's done that is because of the determinism of it being a pure function, you can replay an arbitrary series of actions and always come to the same eventual end state. Okay, and that's why things like time travel debugging work in Redux, is because we're following those pure functional rules. There are similar sort of things in React as well. If we sort of squint, the state update, component state update looks the same. I haven't done any React, by the way. I've just copied and pasted this stuff off the React website, so it might be completely wrong, but let's see how we go. So what you'll notice between this wrong example and this correct example is one of those is a pure function and one isn't. And the reason why it's important that it be a pure function and that it only operate on the inputs is that React performs optimizations. It makes sure it can batch up the state updates and make sure it doesn't run them unless it needs to. And so this is again not an accident, but it's it requires pure functions in order to work the way that we're expecting it to. There are some other things in React. So if we look at this now, you're all expert functional programmers, expert at spotting pure functions. This is pretty clearly a pure function. It's deterministically rendering some sort of user interface based on the properties that have been passed in. Okay, and again, that's not by accident. And React takes advantage of this being a pure function in that it will only re-render your components if it knows that they're going to change. If it knows that the properties haven't changed, it knows it doesn't need to re-render. And obviously the other thing that it's doing is it's not actually manipulating the DOM, it's not performing a side effect, it's just returning a fragment of virtual DOM, if you like, and deciding to go off and do its own thing. And that's really great because that makes, it means we're writing more pure functional code. And I think even in the case, React breaks the rules in a couple of different areas, but even in the case where we're looking at a component with local state, I think you can still sort of squint at it and say, well, if we imagine that the props in the state were parameters, we can sort of call this maybe a pure function. Yeah. So that's I guess that's just a brief look at some of the areas within regular JavaScript code where you're probably already using functional code. So I'm going to leave it there. So remember, I had one of those. Did you not have one? Yes, yeah. That's going to date us there, I think, Bob. So to sum up, I don't think functional programming is as complicated or scary as I think people would tend to make it out as. And certainly don't talk to Haskell developers because they spew a bunch of jargon at you and it doesn't really make any sense. I think the important thing is just making sure, the important thing is you're already doing it, and as long as you can recognise where the pure functions are, where you should split things into pure functions versus side effects, that's the core of functional programming as far as I'm concerned. And it makes your code gooder. It does all the things that we talked about before, makes it more understandable, more testable, more reliable, all of that sort of thing. So, next steps. Now, I hope everyone is excited as I am that 90s dance pop sensation Steps are releasing a new album. You're welcome. So, next steps. I know you're all excited about function programming now and you want to go home and do some, so maybe have a look at, well, after beers obviously, maybe have a look at some code that you're really familiar with and work out how you might split out the logic as a pure function and from the side effect components. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it isn't. It's worth having a look and maybe just starting to have a think about it. If you're not up to speed with your collection pipelines, with your map, filter, reduce, honestly, they are worthwhile putting the effort in to really understand how to work with them because generally you can make the code a lot simpler and a lot more reliable if you can use those effectively. And personally, my opinion is you should never use a for loop unless you have to perform side effects. Okay, everything else that you need to do in terms of manipulating data, you should be able to do using those functions. I will say learn a functional language. I think it is definitely the best way to really understand functional programming. I appreciate that not everyone has the time to do it, but if you do, can I suggest Elm? Elm is a language which is specifically designed for front-end development, and it's been specifically designed to be easy for beginners to pick up. So it's a great choice if you are interested in going further and learning a functional language. I think learning languages like that do make you a better JavaScript developer. And if you do that, come along to Perth FP Meetup. I do try and do an intro talk on Elm each month, just how to do some small task in Elm. So hopefully there's something available there for people of all levels. So thanks. That was a typo, and I thought I'm just going to run with it. I will take questions if anyone does have any. Yep.
Can you go to your slides where you have the array pipelines?
Yep. So these ones?
Yep, that one.
Yep.
You were saying all of that are pure functions.
Yep.
So I see you're using current date.
Yep. So current date. So this is. I did wonder whether someone would pick this up. Current date is essentially a closure capture. Okay. So current date will need to be a local variable within this scope. I'm assuming it's been passed in maybe as a parameter. But this is a closure capture. Conceptually, you can think of it as being almost like a literal in this context. When at the time that this function here is created, it's only got a single value.
Yep.
Yep.
So what I'm hearing is that as in that function context alone, it is actually pure. But if you include the variables that the function that calls that create that function, it's not pure.
Yes, if you're accessing current date from outside of here, then yes, it won't be pure. Hopefully, you would be passing it in and make this whole function a pure function. Yep.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's no worries.
No one else?
Yep.
So with side effects, is there, if you're trying to program from a more functional perspective, is there some way that it's kind of better to place or organize them, like in their own non-functional functions, or just in the kind of main area of the component?
Well, there's lots of different ways to do it, unfortunately, and I sort of haven't really tried to get stuck into architecture because that is a bit of a holy war area. One approach, and if you look at the way that languages like Elm do it, is doing a command pattern. So using data types that represent a side effect that you want the runtime to perform. Okay, and that allows you to do a whole lot more in pure functions by just outputting some data. So in the case of something like a web request, rather than actually doing the web request, we just say this URL, this method, call this function once you're done. Okay, and that does allow you to make your side effect code an awful lot smaller because you don't need to worry about, I've got separate function calls for calling these different endpoints. That's one approach for doing it. But yeah, just making sure they're separate and clearly separate is the important thing. As far as your architecture goes, it's going to be whatever fits in. And honestly, I'm not up to speed with a lot of front end how code gets organised in most sort of projects these days. So you're probably best placed to say, yep, I understand how to split that apart. The hardest parts tend to be if you've got some logic that involves side effects interleaved with pure logic. So if you think of like a promise then chain, okay, and you're performing some logic and then making another request and then performing some more logic and then making another request. And again, it's just really a case of making sure that logic is split out into a function that you can test independently. Yep.
If there's a use case where, for whatever reason, you want to ensure that your function is pure, like I know in, used it for a really long time, but I know in Haskell, like you would say like, anytime you want to do a side effect, you have to like explicitly write it in to say, no, I'm serious, I want to do some I/O, so here's my I/O part.
Yep.
Obviously in JavaScript, you can do whatever you want, as far as that's concerned. Is there any way in JavaScript, if you wanted to ensure that you wrote a pure function that can't verify it?
Not that I know of. There will be. So Bodelstock, I don't know if anybody know who she is. She did a joke ESLint config many years ago called JavaScript the Good Parts, which basically turned off everything in JavaScript that wasn't pure functional. I don't know if anybody actually used it, but there are probably things you can do within ESLint. As I mentioned, I've found an ESLint config that will detect object mutability or object mutation. And that'll pick up anywhere where you're modifying an object. I'm not recommending dropping that in without doing substantial rewrites, obviously, but those are the types of things you can look at. You really, with JavaScript, you are reliant on static analysis to a great extent. But yeah, I mean, a lot of languages. Look, most languages, even when they're I guess more geared towards functional programming, a lot of those don't necessarily have any sort of compile time checks over whether or not something's pure. As an example, in F#, I've talked about adding a pure modifier to functions to enforce it at the compile level, but it's not available at the moment. I think Rust might have one. I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, but certainly nothing available out of the box in JavaScript. Just you're relying on lint. All right. Well, one more.
Just one last question on the sum by, sum by function.
Yep.
In one
I've
slide.
got a missing. Yeah. That's.
In the previous slide where you pass in a function to the sum by.
Yes. Yep. Here.
Yeah. If get value is not a pure function, does that make sum by a non-pure function?
Yes, it does, and that's always a risk when you're passing functions in as parameters. And ultimately in JavaScript, there's nothing stopping you from doing anything you want in any of these functions. It's more a case of just trying to follow the rules where you can. Certainly, you would expect operations like this. If you're doing any sort of non-deterministic stuff, it's probably not going to do what you want, and you just really got to rely on being sensible. More than anything else, and being able to recognise pure functions, as I said before, that's 80% of the task in terms of writing code more functionally. All right, thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. All right. So we've just got a quick presentation by Chris from GovHack, and then we will do switch over.
Do you need a thing, Chris? I was thinking about going that way.
Good talk, man.
Did they go for free? There are a few of them.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready. You escape
Hi everyone, I'm just going to quickly talk to you about GovHack, which is actually happening next month. And basically GovHack is a non-profit organisation run by volunteers, of which I'm one of them. I'm actually the WA Regional Director for GovHack. So I've been busy trying to sort things out in terms of venues and sponsors, and also challenge sponsors as well as volunteers. So basically, GovHack we're running simultaneously around Australia and New Zealand, and basically, we'll be actually using open data. It's available from either internationally available data, public data, federally, Australian-wide public data as well as New Zealand, and statewide and local government data are all available for you to work with. And so on the weekend itself, it's going to run for 48 hours. I mean, you don't actually have to be here all the time. You just turn up at the beginning to decide what challenges you want to accept and put together teams. The challenges are actually sponsored, so if you actually decide to take on a sponsored challenge, there is a prize available to you if you actually win. But you don't necessarily have to take a sponsored challenge. You can actually pick whatever data sets you like and try and solve a problem or come up with an application built based on that public data. And so basically it's open to anyone, across students, public servants, tech, data lovers, and all skill levels. And it's available across Australia. So at the moment, the competition themes for this year are basically energy, infrastructure, agriculture, environment, digital future, and health and well-being. So you can basically go and look at all the data sets that are available and pick something of interest in those areas, or if you look at the try and find a sponsored one and try and basically solve that. So basically, and you get more information by looking at govhack.org, and the details about the challenges are actually on hackerspace.gov.org, and you can have a look at last year's and the previous year's competition results and types of challenges that people have actually gone into, and you can have a look at other project submissions as well. And if you have any further questions about it, you choose one of the, if you can't find an answer to any questions you've got, just email support@govhack.org. Thank you.
Chris, so you're around for a bit today?
Yep. I'll be around next morning tonight if you have any further questions.
Good to go.
I could try using that and see if that helps.
We're going to do another seamless transfer.
It's in, if it fits. Ish. Yes. Oh, do you need to mic up?
Yeah, don't know. How does this thing work?
Just clip it on.
Anyone need the water or anything? Just wave at me when you get you one. 2 waters, 3 waters, 4 waters. Okay.
Thanks,
Be right back.
Where does it clip? Just anywhere? In the collar? Just like here? Here? Yeah. Is that good?
This is on the edge of your glass.
That would have been good. Oh, wrong one. Play. Oh, can we extend display?
Deno or Deno?
It was originally being pronounced as Deno, but they changed to Deno. You ready, DT? Cool. All right, well, g'day everybody. For those of you who haven't met me before, I'm Luke. Been coming along to Fenders for quite a while and fairly active on the Fenders Slack. In particular, the JavaScript channel, which is what I'm here to chat to you about today, a new JavaScript runtime called Deno. So just to start with a little bit of background about the Deno project. It was conceived and initially created by the same guy who created Node.js many, many years ago. He sort of hung around the Node project for a couple of years, did a lot of the early work, and then sort of disappeared. I think he was in doing a lot of stuff with Go, and then sort of came back many years later to try to use it as a scripting language. And it was announced at JSConf EU 2018 in a talk, 10 Things I Regret About Node.js. It's a really fantastic talk. Recommend looking it up on YouTube and having a watch. In that talk, he didn't, from sort of going through, didn't actually have 10 things. There were 7 things, though you could probably split a couple of them up. In particular, the ones for that influenced Deno was security. Node is pretty, you run a script, it can do anything. You've got no real controls over what it can and can't do. Build system and also the module system. It was really a bit of a afterthought. It didn't come originally, and he really didn't like how a lot of things there worked out. So based on that, he came up with a list of design goals for a new JavaScript runtime to make scripting easy. And the core things were security, simple module system, so no importing a folder path and having index.js show up, no magic standard library imports or anything like that. Have TypeScript just built in. So TypeScript files should just work. And also, if you've got TypeScript, you get JavaScript out of the box. And then also a single executable for all the things. So coming back to Node, he found if he wanted to get some stuff working, needed a bundler, had to choose between 5 different options, huge configs, then lots of options for linting, testing, version management, building, bundling, executing. So those were the original design goals. And that's pretty much what they've landed on today. It's now no longer a prototype, very sort of stable thing. And it's secure by default. I'll talk about that a bit later. TypeScript out of the box, single executable, and a whole bunch more. Here's a little diagram I pinched from their architecture docs. I don't really understand their architecture. That's not this talk. But a couple of things to call out from it. Deno uses Rust under the hood, as well as a little bit of C++ with the V8 stuff, like Node and a couple of other JS runtimes. It's built on top of V8, and then a bunch of TypeScript and some JavaScript for the front end. And also just a quick mention, Deno is now backed by a company. This was created by Ryan Dahl and a couple of the core contributors. And they're not selling Deno Plus commercial. They're building services which use Deno. And currently they've just got one. It's a bit in beta. I'll mention it later. So getting started with Deno. It's pretty easy. As mentioned before, single executable. So if you go to deno.land, it'll give you the little script that you need to run. Now I apologize, I forgot the screen size. I got it the right resolution, but for those of you at the back, it might be a bit small. But essentially, we just throw in a command that'll download the file, extract it, and you've now got a command that's ready to do all the things you need to do. So if you just have a look at Deno help, it sort of talks through the different commands that are available. We'll ignore all that for now. And so to start with, I'll talk a little bit about the Deno REPL. For those of you who aren't familiar with REPL, if you've used Node, Python, PHP, you probably will be familiar. If you've just been doing JavaScript in a browser, you'll likely be familiar with the DevTools console. which is essentially a REPL. So the Deno REPL is pretty easy to get started with. You just, here's the help on it. Just run Deno REPL help to see all this. I won't go through a lot of what is available. One thing I will just mention is if you've used Node, you're probably familiar with running a Node script with a debugger in Chrome attached. You can do that on the REPL in Deno as well, which is pretty cool. So we'll do that. So let's get our REPL. Just run the command. I've passed the inspect, so that just adds that extra line of there's a debugger up and listening. You see that there. And then just start typing some code. So here we're just going to log out hello to the console. The REPL has syntax highlighting, nice to have. And we can see we've got hello dropped out there. And if you've got that debugger attached, it will also print out there as well. Pretty cool. It also supports TypeScript in the REPL as of last night. So you'll notice this was actually a Canary version I was using to do these slides, but that's if you run that script to install Deno, it'll just be available out of the box now. So we'll just assign a variable to const with types, do some math. Won't show up in the inspector just yet because we haven't logged anything. So if you want to do that, there we go. The next thing I'll just quickly touch on is the Deno eval. Eval is a command that just lets you pass a string of TypeScript or JavaScript and have it evaluated immediately. So won't look at the options there, but here we've just got a console.log string that we want to get evaled. And if we run that, we'll get a hello world. If you want to use TypeScript for eval, you do need to pass a flag to let it know the extension is TS, but still possible to do and quite easy. So the main way that you'll probably interact with Deno is through the Deno run command. That's essentially you've got a TypeScript file with a load of code in it, and you want to run that. So again, the Deno help has a lot of information about how to use it. At the top, there's a load of stuff about permissions. I'll touch on that a bit later, but out of the box, it won't let you do a lot of things, like network and file system access. So just getting confused. So I'm just going to create a file, throw a console.log in it, and run that code. And so run that code, plopped out hello world. Nice and simple stuff. So if you want to do network access or file system access, it would have actually thrown out an error there. And that's because Deno is totally paranoid about security. It's designed to ensure that you really have to think about what you're doing. And so if you've got a dependency that's got a dependency that's got a dependency that got hijacked on GitHub and somebody put in a Bitcoin miner that'll only run on CI if it detects, it's a lot less likely that that will work in Deno because it won't have permissions to. So one there is just the allow read. So here I've just set up a file with a little bit of data and set up another TS file that'll just try to read that data and console log it out. And for those of you who don't like the terminal stuff, this is essentially those files there. So if we try to run that, we'll get this permission denied. Really, Deno as well, I don't think it's a design goal, but it's just something they do. They provide extremely informative error messages that try to guide you to exactly the thing that you need to do. So here it tells you that you need to add the allow flag and exactly why you need to add that. So if we add that to this one, then we'll now be able to read that data file and print it out. So before going into sort of more on the scripting, I should mention Deno's kind of got weird imports if you're coming from Node or a lot of front-end projects these days that sort of are bundled. Deno requires full paths, so no index.js, auto getting add to a directory. You need to use the extension, and this is following the ECMAScript 6 import-export standard. And actually, Node has just landed experimental support for this under a flag. So whilst it's weird in Deno right now, you'll probably start to see it in Node in a year or so. So here's how that looks. I've just set up a little arithmetic file. I'll install this demo from Deno. It's just got an add and multiply with just the export keyword. And then in another local file, I can just import those and have that work out of the box. If I've got a remote dependency, I actually need to add the URL and the full path to it, and then that'll work out of the box too. And I've put in a little bit of functional programming there, but it's probably the functional programming stuff that Sam wouldn't recommend. So you can notice there that this is actually a .js extension, and I can't mouse over this code right now because it's not actually open, but it would have type safety there. And how that happens, just need to go on a little bit of a sidetrack about how TypeScript and types works. I stole a lot of the content from these slides from a recent blog post by Kitson Kelly, an Australian who is on the core team of Deno. But essentially, in TypeScript, there's two worlds. There's the code world, and there's the type world. So when the TypeScript compiler's checking everything, it's sort of going through the type world. And then when you're running in the browser or Node, you're in the code world. And so here we've just got a little bit of an example for a TypeScript.ts for consumers. Say I'm an author, I'm publishing that library. I'll generally provide a .js file and a .d.ts file. And as consumers hit that, they'll use that somehow. There's a range of different ways that I won't go into here. So Deno's weird imports continued. And it's the same importing remote modules with types, actually just importing modules with types. When Deno is going to run a program, it's got to build up a dependency tree of all the modules, and for every module, it's got two slots, the code slot and the type slot. And when resolving the dependency, it's got to work out what to put in the type slot. So the easiest way that this happens is if you're importing TypeScript, it just throws both of them in there. So here we import a TypeScript file, and it'll just get the types from that file. Nice and simple. Similar to TypeScript elsewhere, if you import JavaScript with adjacent definition files, it'll just pick up the types from that definition file. So if you're familiar with TypeScript, that's in Node or front end, it'll be fairly familiar. Option 3, this is something that just comes out of the box in TypeScript, but it's pretty rare to see. It's / directive, and this, if you're authoring some JS, you can just throw in a comment at the top of the file and let consumers know where there's a handcrafted type file. So that works nicely in Deno as well. Then there's the Deno types comment. This is something that's only in Deno. And when you're importing something, so if you're importing a remote module, it just lets you put a comment above and tell Deno, hey, I've got some types for this either locally or I know about some external ones. And then finally, a fairly recent option, some Deno-aware CDNs. They've added support to their sort of language server when they're loading modules. If it's a remote module, it can be served with this magical header, X TypeScript types, that'll point at a definition file, and it will load the definitions from there. Currently, it's got support in a couple of CDNs. esm.sh was built, that CDN is built specifically for Deno. but also making sure that all the Deno things are available in China. And Skypack, it's supported, but you just need to add a little string to the end of the import, and then it will add the X TypeScript types. It does a bit of magic to sort of automatically work out where it should grab those types. It'll have a look if it's a node project, look in sort of package.json types. It'll have a look on the TypeScript at types project, and a couple of other spots. Finally, just touch on Deno and web platform APIs. So one of the goals of Deno is to be as browser compatible where possible. There's a recent tweet that I saw about the top 10 JS frameworks you need to know. Of those, all of them are available in Deno, with the exception of document. You can't really do a lot without a canvas for that, but where possible, Deno will go with the browser APIs. And in fact, a couple of times where there's a browser API that's still under exploration, they'll hold off implementing anything until the browser stuff comes out. And so just a quick demo of that. We'll jump into the handy REPL again, without an inspector this time, and just do a little fetch. Fetch is how you fetch things these days in JS. And we'll just assign that to a little const we've got there, and log that out to the console, which will give us a huge string of HTML, and not too useful. Cool. So some things I've used Deno for currently. In my previous role, used it for developing some quick tooling to scrape Figma files and sync all of the illustration and iconography to the file system. It was pretty handy being able to do it in Deno. That ran on super old environments that we didn't really have access to beyond just dropping code on there. So being able to throw in binaries was super handy. Quick and easy TypeScript REPL. Also used it recently to script some UI to cheat at some PlayStation games. I'd seen there was a project that lets you sort of easily move the mouse around and do keyboard strokes. And there was a glitch in a PlayStation game that if you saved and loaded and saved and loaded, you'd get infinite experience. It would take forever, so just got up a handy little text editor, wrote up a quick little script. I was able to run that straight away without having to sort of work out bundlers or anything else. And yeah, it was really good fun. Sadly, I don't have a video of that, but yeah. And just finally, a little bit on the state of the tools and communities. So Deno, they're obviously playing in a similar space to Node. So for them, they've got a load of benchmarks about how they compete on network. And they were a bit slower for quite a while than Node. They've recently rewritten all of their HTTP stack. And so now they're comparable and faster for certain workloads. They've got a phenomenal VS Code integration. Those weird imports that you saw, and also just making sure that some of the Deno global stuff works. The VS Code plugin is managed by that Kitson Kelly gentleman I mentioned before, who's on the Deno core team. So good support there. It's super fun to use. Got a very active community and loads of development going on. Pretty stable. They've been at V1 for about 1.5 years now, and they're aiming for no breaking changes till 2, which I'm not sure when that's happening. Deno deploy, that's the thing I sort of mentioned a bit earlier. It's what the Deno company's doing to try to make money. Super cool. Really recommend checking it out. Their demo code to have a real-time chat player, real-time chat board is about 15 lines of code to get that running, and you just point it at a JS file, and it just works. You don't need building or anything like that. But it's still in beta, no pricing or anything like that. And React server-side rendering sort of frameworks, pretty rubbish, to be honest, at this stage. Keep trying to use it with Deno, and it's just not there yet. In particular, you can get React working, but you just lose type safety. The types are really designed about being used with node global types, and yeah, so a bit sad there. And that's it. So cheers, Fenders. And yeah, recommend checking out the Denoland website and the company. Happy to take any questions.
I'll ask mine later.
Cool.